Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel. My name is James and you're watching Wonderful World. And I've been really busy lately working on something awesome. And I've considered for quite a while doing a video on what my dream reptiles would be. Reptiles that I would like to have someday in the future. And if I was to make that video right now, a boa constrictor would be very high on that list. Well, I've decided that I'm going to get a boa constrictor. One reason it took me a while to come to that decision is because boas get very large, and an enclosure large enough for a boa means building a custom-built enclosure. And while setting up an enclosure for most reptiles and amphibians is relatively easy, you basically take a glass terrarium and put a background on it and add the necessary stuff it needs and you're done. But one thing I can tell you about myself is that while I might be creative, I am not very handy when it comes to tools and building things. The only power tools I own are a circular saw and a cheap drill. And aside from that, the only other tools I use to build this enclosure is a screwdriver with some interchangeable bits and a handheld jigsaw, a rip saw, and a cheap paintbrush. But even with that being the case, I'm pretty happy with what I was able to come up with. And this is definitely something that if I could do, you could do too. So I'm going to take you through every step I did to make this enclosure from start to finish. So let's get started building. I did spend quite a bit of time planning out how I wanted to build this enclosure and have a pretty good rough idea. It's going to be of dimensions of 4 feet long by 2 feet wide by 4 feet tall. And while this is going to be a minimum size enclosure for a boa constrictor, if I get a male, I think it will be quite a while before it might outgrow it. And if and when it does, I'll cross that bridge when I get there. Plus, this is going to be a huge enclosure for a baby or a young boa. But I'm not worried about that as long as I plan for that and set it up with lots of cover and multiple places to hide and find heat and water. So the first thing I did was to carefully measure out pieces of plywood and 2x2s and built framed in panels for the sides, the top, and the bottom. And with those completed, I basically arrived at a sturdy 4x2x4 box for the skeleton of this build. This is going to be a bioactive enclosure and it will have plants. And since boas need a little bit higher level of humidity, it will be getting misted enough to keep a higher humidity. My plan is that it won't be wet enough to need a false bottom, but I do want it to be sealed and reasonably waterproof. So I ran a thick bead of silicone around all of the edges and seams, and then I painted the inside with dry lock. And by the time I was done, I put 5 coats of dry lock on it. And then I painted the outside of it black to match other furniture in the reptile room. I want this enclosure to hold humidity but still have plenty of airflow. So I installed a vent on the side and I installed a screen mesh on the top for lights. I did this by cutting a rectangular area out of the top and nailing down some molding to hold down the screen. And by the time I was done, this screen is really sturdy and tight. And then I also installed some wheels on the bottom so it will be easy to move if I need. For heat, I'll be using a DP projector and a UVB light to create a basking spot higher up. But I also want to include a warm hide with a heat mat at the ground level. And this can be a challenge when you have a bioactive enclosure filled with a thick layer of substrate. So to work around that, I've repurposed a wooden box by cutting out a section of the bottom, and I put a hole in the back of the enclosure for the cord, and I'll be attaching the heat mat to a ceramic tile that will sit over the box. And this way there's still some space for air to flow underneath the heat mat, and I can remove the ceramic tile and have access to the heat mat if I need. And then I can put the warm side hide on top of all of this. So now it's time to give this enclosure a background. And I knew this enclosure, being the size that it is, would use a ton of spray foam and silicone, and that can get expensive. So to minimize that, I came up with a plan to cover a large amount of that space with pieces of bark that I gathered in the woods. That way, the only thing I have to cover with silicone would be the spaces between the pieces of bark. So I attached all of the bark using Great Stuff spray foam, and I also used a couple of plastic pots to make some planters. And doing each side and then the back took quite a while when you include the time to let the spray foam cure. Then I carved the spray foam to the shape that I wanted. After doing all of that, I covered any exposed spray foam with silicone and then pressed substrate into the silicone. I had a lot of moss left over from the day gathering stuff in the woods, so I chopped up a bunch of moss with a pair of scissors and covered some parts of the background with moss and other parts with coconut coir. And this is what the completed background looks like. Boa constrictors are semi-arboreal and love to climb, especially when they are younger. So I've added plenty of limbs and branches for climbing throughout the enclosure. and place those to make some excellent spots for basking under the deep heat projector and UVB. So with the background being done, the next thing I did was install pieces onto the front to create a substrate dam and also to accommodate the door. And for the door, I did something a little different. I used a really large picture frame and replaced the glass with a piece of plexiglass and attached that to the front with partial wrap cabinet hinges so the entire thing can be completely opened. It's a big door and needs a lot of space as it swings open, but I love the way it turned out. And now comes the fun part, which is adding plants and making it bioactive. I put in about 6 inches of ABG mix, and this was definitely the most ABG mix I've ever made at one time. I picked up several plants at the nursery, and for this vivarium, I went for plants that have a lot of color in their foliage. And this plant, which I don't know what it is, has a lot of red and pink in its foliage. And this big philodendron on the right has cream colors and yellow and lime green. And I found an arrowhead plant that is a dark chocolatey brown. And I also put in the ZZ plant, which has lived in my reptile room for a long time. I have a lot of moss that I collected in the woods, and I covered every bit of exposed substrate with a layer of moss. I love the way it looks, and the moss will help to hold in humidity. My oldest son moved to New Mexico several months ago, and I've been babysitting all of his plants. And one of those plants is this big philodendron. It fits perfectly in this vivarium, so I'm stealing it. Sorry, Gabriel. I hope he's not too disappointed, but my wife is going to be disappointed that I took it out of our kitchen where it was living. I'll just have to make it up to both of them. And for some final touches, I added several cuttings from plants in other vivariums and some of my other house plants. I used cuttings from some trailing watermelon begonia, a shingle plant, and some monstera. I'm really happy with how this vivarium came out. It has a real jungle feel to it, and it will be perfect for a boa constrictor. I need to let it cycle and let the plants get rooted in. Plus, I'm going on a vacation in a couple of weeks, so it might be a month or so before I get that snake, but I'll be sure to let you know when I do. For now, I'll just leave you with some shots of this completed vivarium. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.